Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Beautifully Broken podcast. We're here with my good friend Jason Earle. Jason, welcome to the show again.
So good to be here.
Yeah, it's an honor to have you here. We could talk for hours and hours, but I had actually a deep longing, a deep knowing that within the collective consciousness right now, with all that's going on in the world, it's so important to understand air quality. And as we become these digital nomads and we start to travel around the country and explore different areas, and we're looking at what is the value of home ownership versus renting, my mind always goes back to, well, I've created this really safe environment in my home. I know my air quality. What happens when I travel? What happens when I'm a renter? What happens when it's a property that I don't know the history of? So I had this idea pop into my head. It's like the renter's guide to mold management and avoidance. And of course, you're my person. You're my person to answer these questions.
Perfect. No, I love it. And by the way, we're here to talk about renter, the renter's playbook, if you will.
The renter's playbook.
Yeah. But I just got back from 2 weeks in Asia to move production of our air sampling pump over from China to Thailand, and while I was over there, I dealt with a lot of moldy hotels. And so it's an interesting conversation because travel and mold, and also renting and mold, they're different animals and for very different reasons. And we should focus on the renters piece, but for sure the travel piece, especially with the digital nomad thing, once you no longer truly own your abode, you then have stakeholders and permissions you need to get from people. And it's a very disempowering place to be. I'm an indoor air quality expert, and I couldn't find a safe place to sleep in 2 weeks,
Yeah.
So it's a challenge.
Yeah. Safety. What a great word to unpack. I have a billion ideas for different episodes, but we will, to your course correction, we will stick with renters. I think that's a great adjustment. Thank you for keeping me on task. So just Jason, jumping in, mold 101, it's all about moisture. Maybe we can just start there as far as a renter's application.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best place to start, because I think when it comes to understanding what your rights as a renter, the fundamental confusion, or the fundamental problem with that conversation, especially if you're going to go out and start exercising those rights, is to be able to speak to them in a way that doesn't undermine your efforts, right? And so the first thing for people to understand is that mold is not the problem. Mold is a symptom of a moisture problem. Mold growth is not something that happens accidentally. It's not like lightning striking you. It's not an earthquake, this sudden thing that just kind of like tears apart the space-time continuum and you're the victim of it. It's actually a very repeatable natural phenomenon that occurs when stuff gets wet and stays wet for more than a couple of days. And so, mold spores are a natural part of our environment, or especially of a healthy environment. And in fact, what's really interesting is that kingdom fungi every year produces 50 megatons of spores. And so this includes macrofungi, so mushrooms as well as molds and yeast and stuff like that. But every year, kingdom fungi produces 50 megatons, which is the equivalent of 500,000 blue whales. Every year. Okay, largest producer of biological particulate on the planet. And mold spores are so ubiquitous on the planet that weather balloons will find them 13.7 miles above the Earth's surface in clouds, in their own spore clouds. And so when we talk about mold spores, they're often talked about as if they're these nuclear packets, these things that are going to attack you, as if they're pathogen. Some of them are pathogens, but very, very few. Out of the 140,000 known and identified, there's only a few that can actually cause actual human infectious disease, and only about a dozen or so produce mycotoxins that are worth talking about.
What are the spores that cause the overwhelming of fungi to grow throughout the body, like The Last of Us on HBO?
Well, the good news is that's a wonderful conflation of science fiction and science fact. And so cordyceps it's actually a mushroom that's fascinating though, as it is in real life. They call it the zombie fungus, and it actually does it does pathogenically grow within ants, and so if you want to watch something really fun, just go Google cordyceps and ants, and what it does is it gets in there and it infects them, and it actually fills up their shell, and it takes over their brain, their mind, and it forces them to go to the tallest piece of grass they can find in their environment, and then their jaw locks on to the branch, the highest branch or blade of grass, and then the fruiting body shoots out of their forehead and sporulates onto the colony. That is the cordyceps go-to-market strategy. Okay, it literally is body control, mind control, and then go forth and prosper. And so it's a remark. And by the way, the ants know when this happens, and they'll see the guy acting a little weird. They'll be like, okay, he's got it. And they'll pick him up, and they will sacrifice their own lives and carry him outside of the colony and they'll die because they'll get infected too. And so, yeah, no, cordyceps is real. It's just not real in that context. It would be scary if it were. And actually, truth
Not
is, it
yet.
would probably not. I mean, give us enough time, right? We're doing some pretty funky stuff with the planet. I mean,
I know. Jason, back to moisture. So when I hear the idea of moisture, that sounds like it's more of the base of the pyramid, which can create this true like systemic problem. When I am a renter and I'm coming into a space, I'm examining a 2-bedroom apartment I might want to take over. What are the places that I would identify to check for moisture as a renter, in your opinion?
Well, looking for moisture, I think that, well, first of all, the most common problems in apartments usually revolve around the ventilation systems. So in other words, bathroom exhaust vents, kitchen exhaust vents, if they even exist. This is especially a problem in cities where you've got a lot of older structures like New York City, where the building code also will often say that if there's a window in the bathroom, you don't need an exhaust vent. That's a very common code nationwide. And this is insane because that means that you have to open your windows to get fresh air when it's really humid or really cold or really hot, and it just doesn't make sense. And oftentimes what you're then doing is bringing in more moisture into the space that you're trying to ventilate. So building code tends to lag common sense and certainly lags best practice by at least a decade. But the bottom line is that landlords will only, in most cases, build to or maintain to code. Because the building, listen, let's face facts. A landlord's business model is invest as little as possible in the property and charge as much as they possibly can for rent, and so that means investing as little as possible in maintenance, get it done, but as little as necessary, right? This is the business model. So invariably, there are going to be corners cut, right? There's just no two ways about it. So you want to understand that those limitations come with renting. And so, you're not going to get the Shangri-La, when or more importantly, you're not going to get a house like yours or mine, in most cases, unless you are, very, very fortunate. So you have to just be, go flip the bathroom exhaust vent, see if it runs. And how do you test that, by the way? With a piece of toilet paper. Put the toilet paper next to the fan. If it sucks the paper up into it, then it works.
Then it's
otherwise
functioning.
It doesn't work. Those common exhaust channels, or they're passive. They're actually not technically passive, but the little square vents that you see in New York City apartments a lot. Those are common exhaust vents, and so they have a fan on the roof. You can test those because those usually don't work. Those have been disconnected or the fans are turned off to save electricity. So those are really important things because they are a building maintenance requirement, and they're a building maintenance issue, but they also have a direct impact on your ability to maintain a healthy environment. Because whether it's your exhaust from your kitchen, which is going to generate moisture and pollutants from the cooking, or whether it be from showering and just breathing, or even if you've got house plants they transpire. Water comes out of them. Water goes in and water comes out. Especially if you've got more than one person living in the apartment, people generate moisture. We are mostly moisture, and so making sure that ventilation works is key. Number two, you want to look for any visible signs of moisture, right? And so you're going to look at windowsills to see if you've got condensation, if you've got black mold growth around the perimeter of the windows. That may indicate that the building has a humidity issue and it's manifesting as mold and mildew on the windowsills. And you want to look around baseboard trim also if it's peeling away. I'm not talking about a little tiny gap where the paint, I'm talking about, when you really see that the building materials have shifted, which is usually a sign that there's a moisture problem, which causes expansion and contraction. And when two different materials get wet, they will expand and contract at different rates. And that's where you'll get the trim will shift and you'll see gaps and you'll see wavy gravy stuff. Also flooring that's cupped, buckled, warped, things like that. You want to, if the flooring is not, sometimes it's designed to be that way. It's been scraped and it's got character. That's not what I'm talking about. A water damaged floor has its own signature kind of, dead giveaway. And that tends to happen towards the perimeter of the floor, again, near windows, right? And near porches, balconies. These are real serious points of entry. We see that all the time. And then lastly, you want to really look at the HVAC system. Oftentimes these are heat pumps or they are in-wall, what they call PTAC units. And these units are notoriously problematic from the perspective of getting dirty. And so when they get dirty, it means the filters haven't been cleaned enough. They will get moldy because dirty HVAC systems get moldy because the dust is what supports the fungal growth. So these things have to be cleaned very, very regularly. And it means swapping out filters, and then they should be at least annually maintained, if not before the beginning of the cooling season and at the end of the cooling season.
Can you just insert an explainer? Why does dust to support fungal growth?
Excellent. Yeah. So going back to mold 101, right? Mold requires just a few things to grow. Mold is, and actually even back up further, mold is nature's digestive organism. Mold is the great recycler. Mold's job is to turn things that were at one time living back into dirt to support further growth, right? So that's what mold is here to do. It's just to continue that. Without mold and without fungi, we would have piles of dead plant matter all over the world. In fact, we did have that, and that's why we have oil and coal and all that stuff, because before we had fungi on the planet, that stuff accumulated, and then eventually that got buried. And then that's why we have that, is because it was pre-fungi. And so now, it's doing its job if it's doing that to leaves and twigs and sticks in your yard, but not so much when it's doing that to the wallboard or carpet padding in your living room. And so that's where we end up with a problem. So when we're talking about why mold grows on dust, well, dust is essentially broken down material from our living spaces, right? Some is oftentimes skin cells, human and pets, as well as pests. And of course, stuff that comes in from also building shedding. So paint particles. When you have to repaint, why do you have to repaint? Well, where did that paint go? When you have to refinish your floor, where did that finish go? Well, it went into the dust in your house, which is a good reason for you to use HEPA filters and HEPA filtered air cleaners anyway, because that's chemicals. That's not just mold. That's really concentrated chemical and VOC, concentrated VOCs. This is really nasty stuff. This is the stuff that cancer's made of, So we want to mechanically remove those things from our house. But the dust that accumulates in our HVAC systems and in our filters is like pre-digested part. It's already like pre-chewed for mold, It's very easy. And mold spores are already in there because mold spores, like we said, are so ubiquitous. If you look at dust, you'll see skin cells, spores, pollen, and building material particles. And then you'll see hair and all that kind of stuff with macro. But really on the micro side, what you'll see is basically biological particles and lots of little bits of buildings. And mold loves that stuff. It's like so easy to eat. It's like snackables.
Yeah.
And plus it absorbs moisture really well. And so it's perfect. So when we say the healthy home mantra or the healthy apartment mantra, to stay on point, stay on topic here, the healthy building mantra is clean and dry. Because when mold requires these back to requirements, when mold grows, it only requires a few things. The spores, of course, which are like the microscopic seeds that contain all the DNA. And then it requires oxygen. These are aerobic microbes. So they do require oxygen, at a comfortable temperature, and which is interesting because they basically like the temperature that we do. That's why they grow in our houses, right alongside of us. It's, evolutionarily speaking, this we're very similar. We actually have we're very related to fungi, by the way. That's antifungal medications actually harm human tissue. So we are more closely related to fungi than we are bacteria, and so they like our conditions too. And we cohabitate with them, so to speak, and most of the time without any ill effect. But when it starts to grow, it also needs a food source. And that food source is anything that was at one time living, anything that's organic. And I don't mean that in the whole food sense. I mean that in the sense that carbon based, so from former living cells. And so and that's where it derives its nutrition. And of course, it also requires, lastly and most importantly, moisture. So you got spores, temperature, oxygen, and moisture. Now you can't control the oxygen because we need that too. You can't control the temperature because we like to keep our temperature, comfortable for us too. But what you can control is food to some degree. You can keep it clean, although sheetrock supports fungal growth really well, and moisture. And moisture is the one thing you can and must control because, again, we build our buildings out of mold food, and even the cleanest building, if there's enough moisture, will support fungal growth. So the key element here is always moisture control, but then to reduce the likelihood when a moisture problem does present itself, and it will, because we live in a water planet and we all have running water and we all live in places where it rains occasionally. So we will deal with moisture issues. You must also keep things clean rather, to reduce the likelihood of immediate colonization. And that segues into the next part, which is very important, which is that mold growth occurs very quickly. According to the EPA, within 24 to 48 hours, mold will grow if the conditions are right. And what are those conditions? The ones I just outlined: food, water, air, and nutrition. Food, water, air, and moisture. And so you got two days, according to the EPA. According to the IICRC S520, which is the mold remediation standard, you have 72 hours. Actually, the S500 water damage standard says you have 72 hours. Otherwise, you have to go to the mold remediation standard. So 72 hours is the standard. 48 hours is the EPA. So 2 to 3 days is all it takes for mold to begin to grow in the event that you have a moisture problem that isn't dealt with proactively. So this requires vigilance.
Yeah. Yeah. What about, are you a person who, do you believe in operating a dehumidifier in your home or a basement area or such to control the ambient moisture in the air, or keeping that at a certain percentage?
Yes. And it depends on the environment. So like in an apartment, I would say no, because they generate a lot of heat. They're also very expensive in terms of electricity usage. In apartments, your best bet is to use your air conditioner as the dehumidifier that it is. And the key to that is, of course, like I said, making sure that the filters are clean, and making sure that the unit itself, the A coils, which is what allows the air to get cooled, are clean as well, because air is being passed through those, and that's what gets dirty, and that's what gets condensation on it, and that's what gets mold growth on it in an HVAC system most of the time. But you want to use that, and you want to keep your AC on all the time on a lower setting. And I don't mean lower temperature. I mean, as warm as you can tolerate it, but running and consistently. And the reason for that is because when HVAC systems turn on and off, when AC systems, I should say, turn on and off, when it turns off, all of those surfaces in and around the unit are cold. And if they're dirty, or even if they have even just a slight dusting on them, moisture will accumulate. You'll get condensation, especially if the building, if it has not effectively dehumidified, right? An air conditioner is a dehumidifier. That's why you have a condensation line that comes off of that unit and drains to the outside. And this is the case when one of those fails, because it creates a flood in your house, right?
Yes.
So it's pulling moisture out of your air and it's depositing it outside or into a sump or into a pump or something like that. And so that is doing its job. And so but when it cycles on and off, you're stopping the dehumidification process, and you're creating all these cold surfaces, which allow condensation to form. And so this is why, by the way, goes back to the hotel conversation. This is why you get all these moldy hotels, because they put the key card in the door. When you walk in, you put the key card in, and that allows your lights and AC to operate. And then when you take the key card out, they turn off. Well, guess what happens? All the warm, moist air from the hallway or from outside comes in, and then everything gets damp.
Yeah.
Same thing happens inside an AC unit. So when it comes to apartments where you really wouldn't want to put a dehumidifier in a space, I am a big fan of them for basements, crawl spaces, spaces that are out of sight, out of mind, especially if you can set them up so they automatically drain into a pump or a pit, and then you don't have to worry. And you got sensors set up so that you can know when you're in the safe zone, which, by the way, is 40 to 60% relative humidity. The safe zone, according to ASHRAE, which is the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers, is 40 to 60% relative humidity. That's RH is the acronym for that.
40 to 60%.
40 to 60. It's a wide range, but 45 is the target. And the reason for that is because below 40, and it's hard to manage that in the winter because most places dry out pretty aggressively in the winter. Below 40, your mucous membranes dry out, and you can get sick from that alone. It allows direct access to microbes, right? So, and dehumidification. Dehydration is a clear path to disease, to illness and malaise. On the upside, 60%. It's not just mold. Also, you start to get dust mites, and you start to get other allergens that start to grow, proliferate. And so, it becomes an allergen stew, if you will. So mold is growing, allergen, dust mites are throwing off their lovely stuff. We're allergic to dust mite fecal pellets. Did you know that? Isn't that a great little fun fact? Dust mites themselves are not so much of a problem, but their poop is. And because if you look in dust mite poop, you know what they have a lot of? Mold spores. They actually eat mold spores.
Yeah. It is the Lion King. It's a cycle of life. It's fascinating. If I were a renter, and I had a unique history like maybe my own, would it be overkill to say, well, I'm going to keep my AC running constantly on a low flow, and I'm also going to do a dehumidifier if I'm not so concerned about cost, but I'm more concerned about keeping that target relative humidity around that 45 to 60%?
I think you'd probably find it would be overkill.
Mm-hmm.
I think you can accomplish it. Put it this way: if your AC is not able to get your humidity down to 45% or so, it means that you've got air coming in from outside. You know what I mean? You've got significant infiltration happening, which is a whole different conversation. That's a whole different building science discussion.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. So let's just say you've got this all cut. You understood. You've done your walkthrough. You've done your examination of your apartment. And then we're almost gonna, if we keep walking through this pathway, if we were to transition off of this mold 101, I'm a renter. How do we draw a line in the sand, or how do we differentiate my rights as a renter versus the implied like responsibility and ownership of the person supplying the domicile? Like, whose responsibility is it to keep that thing clean and habitable and me healthy? I might know the answer to this.
It's a fascinating conversation, and it's one that fills up courtrooms, nationwide every single day.
Yeah.
And because there's so much confusion about the subject, both from the perspective of the renters and the landlords, everyone's confused about it. The judges are confused about it, right? They have to bring experts in who also disagree about these things in many cases, depending upon who's paying them. And so the key here is there is something, there's legal doctrine that underlies nearly all property leases. Specifically, we're talking about residential. And I'm not a lawyer. I've never played one on TV. And if you have a concern about this, I highly recommend that you get in touch with a lawyer that specializes in landlord-tenant rights or landlord-tenant disputes. However, ask them about the implied warranty of habitability. IWOH is what you'll see the acronym for it. And what this says, and this is something that's a blind spot for so many people. In fact, many lawyers that I've spoken to are even unaware of this. It says that landlord's primary obligation is to provide safe and clean housing, safe and clean. That's primary. In fact, it's so primary, it's so basic that it's implied, and it's not even in the lease. It's the legal doctrine. It's the bedrock upon which lease agreements are written. Okay, that's how fundamental it is. And so, how do you define safe and clean? Well, it's pretty safe to say, not to overuse safe, but it's easy to understand that mold indoors is probably not clean, right? Clean. I mean, you wouldn't think moldy environment. That's not a clean environment, right? But what's safe? Well, safe is a little bit more nebulous, right? Because then you start getting into this idea about what's the toxic mold conversation, which is just that nobody wins in that discussion. But what you can say is very simple. Do you have or do you fall into the high risk categories? Are you very young, or do you have very young children? Very young, very old? Do you have a compromised immune system? Do you have pre-existing condition of any sort of kind that would be high risk? Are you dealing with? Do you have any sort of respiratory issue or environmental sensitivities? Specifically, do you have asthma, allergies, chronic sinusitis? Any of these issues would allow you to be able to quickly and easily get a letter from a doctor saying that my patient is under my care, and a moldy environment is deleterious to their health. And so that then makes it not safe. This is no longer safe. Prima facie, on its face, it's not a safe place for me, right? And so you when you have a situation where you've got a moldy environment, the implied warranty of habitability protects you from a landlord who doesn't respect the fact that that's their primary responsibility, is to provide a safe. And so that, by the way, in California, it's very clear. If you have a broken window, if you have any sort of entry for wind or rain, a building's primary purpose is to shed wind and water. That's it, right? If you really think about it, that's what a building's the two primary purposes: to shed wind and water. And if it fails to do that in any way, then the building has failed. And so basically, a landlord's responsibility is to make sure the building continues to shed wind and water in a way that does not allow for fungal growth or to create an unsafe or unclean environment indoors. So now we got that. Now the question is, when there's a mold problem, whose fault is it? And
that's big.
That is a really big question. This is what fills up the courtrooms, right? Whose fault is it? Everyone's pointing fingers. Well, it depends on the source of the water.
Yeah.
It depends on the source of the water. And this is where, you get into hiring guys like me, because, figuring out where the water comes from is not always super straightforward, right? Water can be tricky. Because water comes in at least two forms, and three really technically if you live in my climate, but it comes in liquid form or vapor, and it moves steadily between those forms. Right? We have ice here a lot, but also you don't have ice down there. Have you seen ice recently?
We have ice. We had crazy ice storms.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, that's right. But
crazy
for like a minute,
ice storms, and we had such a bad ice storm. It's funny. I just had an incident. Because I'll reference this. I have to say, if anybody wants to get the background on Jason, your story, your body of work, your qualifications to speak about mold, fungus, not so much fungus apocalypse, but more just fungus in general, then you can go back to episode 142 with Jason Earle. And it's an excellent episode. But we do reference that I was in a large court case that I won, one of the rare ones that I actually won all my money back from my remediation. And I had an incident recently as a result of an ice storm in which 2 months after the ice storm, the trees were weakened around the home. So these large oaks that cover, it was 8 a.m, no wind, no rain, no nothing. This tree dropped out of the sky, hit my car, crushed all these chairs, scraped down the side of the building. And
oh, wow.
Luckily, it's so funny. It's where it's not funny. It's where there's like a men's circle outside. I mean, literally people would have died. Massive, massive branch. And it just was like, but from my understanding and my educational process alongside my legal team, we learned that we were looking for an incident, i.e. a storm, an injury from a fallen tree, a strike of lightning, a hurricane passing through. I was in New York City at the time. So they were like, did it happen in Sandy? Did it happen here? And then you've got a window within that incident to address said problem. So, but please go on.
No, sorry. I forgot about the ice because you guys obviously Texas was crippled by not just one ice storm. This has happened twice
Just
in recent yeah, right.
yeah, every year it's happened. They've had an awful, and it's been weeks of recovery, weeks of getting electricity back on, and obviously with that comes moisture management.
Right, and so this is where it gets messy sometimes. If you got power outages and you've and that changes things because now whose fault is that? And like so basically this is where the blame game is really where it's problematic. Who's actually really responsible for the moisture problems? So here's a really simple thing. Okay, like one of them basically they refer to it as lifestyle problem. So like if people are they have too many people living in the apartment. This is a common problem. Um, they will blame the tenant. If you're exceeding the capacity of the apartment, this happens a lot. If you're not running your exhaust fans when you're taking showers, baths, cooking. A lot of people cook all day in those. If they've got a lot of family,
Yep.
this is also very common. You have 5 or 6 people living in an apartment, and maybe grandma stays home and she cooks all day for everybody. This is very common, and I wish I had a grandma there cooking for me all day, but but the point is that there's lots and lots of steam that's being produced in that, and oftentimes they're not running exhaust fans, and then that manifests as a moisture problem and a mold problem. People like to dry clothes indoors. Don't do that. That moisture has to go outside. A lot of people actually, I've seen dryers that exhaust inside. People will do that intentionally to heat their house. They'll put a like pantyhose on the outside, on the end of the line to capture the lint and let that heat and quote unquote humidify, and they over humidify. One of the key elements here, and let me back,
Don't do
is
that.
don't do that. This is not.
Don't do that. No, that's not. We're gonna label that as bad.
That's a hose job. You don't want to do that. You want to stay away from that.
Yep.
I couldn't resist. But you want to get yourself a humidity gauge. This is one of the key tools. These are really low cost. Get yourself a good humidity gauge, ideally with multiple remote sensors. And the remotes, you want to make sure that it gives you a good relative humidity and temperature. I like the base station with remote sensors, so you can put them in different areas. It's especially good if you've got a single family home with a crawl space or a basement where the stuff's out of sight, out of mind. You want to be able to look at that stuff without having to go down and look. But for apartments, just knowing in general what your ambient humidity is will help you a lot in terms of, whether or not you've got I always say, don't modify what you don't quantify, right? If you're going to be adding moisture or taking moisture out, don't modify what you don't quantify. People do this all the time with like this, like lick their finger, stick it in the air to see which way the wind's blowing. That is not an effective environmental control tool. There are devices that are really low cost.
What did you say the one that you like is? What's it called?
I've got a bunch of them. Oregon Scientific makes nice, like these units that have a base station and that have remote sensors. But there's another one that I've been using. Sensor Push has a really cool low cost sensor. These are little like keychain sensors, and they're really cool. And I put them all over the house. I've got them outside, and they have a nice little app on your phone. So if you don't want to have like a physical dashboard, I kind of like that stuff. But for people who just want to be able to check on their phone and check wherever you are too, you can be out of town and take a look. I like the Sensor Push units a lot, and they're on Amazon.
Sensor Push units, wonderful.
Yeah, I like those a lot. So whose fault is it? Well, if you're drying your clothes inside and you're not using your bathroom exhaust vents and you're taking forever showers and you've got 6 people living in a 1-bedroom apartment, chances are they're going to point to you. If the water is coming from the roof, a leaky window, water is building up around the foundation, it's making its way into the basement, and that moisture is making its way up into your place, because that's what happens. Moisture rises through a building. A damp basement will manifest on upper floors in many cases, especially attics and where there's really in a cold climate. But the most important thing is to basically say, is the water coming from outside? That's the landlord. If the water's coming from inside, it's you. And that's the hyper reduction. Now there are nuances, of course, right? That could be argued around some of those things. But the bottom line is, for example, if the moisture is coming from inside, but you don't have a bathroom exhaust vent, well, is that the landlord's fault? Well, it depends on what the building code is, and he's going to say, I don't have to do that. Is it a best practice? Yes. Is he required to? No. So
well, this would be a great template also for people examining places, because you do sign a lease, which is the agreement. So it's it comes back to a very simple: what am I agreeing to? Right? These are things to look for when you do a walkthrough on a home. That's what I'm hearing anyway. The functionality of not just that the fan has an exhaust in the bathroom, but that it functions. The toilet paper test, I thought that was great.
And does it go outside? Because a lot of these bathroom exhaust vents, I have opened these things up and they're going right into the ceiling.
Yeah.
That's not going to work. In fact, it's going to work directly against you.
You actually make a petri dish with the drywall. It's actually a great, again, fungus apocalypse. You're going to build
absolutely.
one. I went out to a sorry to interrupt. I went to a conference in Vegas at the Hotel Excalibur, and it was it's a dumpy hotel in Vegas, and they had done a botch job and done this renovation, and of course they had built the exhaust fan right into the ceiling. And I went in there to take a shower, and I got just eyes went crossed. Unbelievable. And the woman we had the team from the hotel come up. They were like, we don't smell anything. I was like, this is unbelievable. I've never smelled anything like this in my life. Anyways, yeah.
No, I had the same thing in China when I was in China 2 weeks ago, and I was at a Grand Hyatt. An American brand, and I walked into my room, and I was like, "Whew, nope, can't do that." I get night terrors. I have really bad sleep disturbances. I've done this too many times I know.
Interesting.
I know how this ends.
Sidebar: you and I both need to do, if you're up for it. This is my mid-podcast invitation. I keep hearing great subjective experience from people doing these extended dry fasts. I'm a faster. I know you're a faster, but I've had several friends at this point go do these 10-day extended dry fasts in the Mediterranean, in Russia, not Russia right now, but getting amazing results, deep cellular clean out, and long-term reduction of symptoms from a previous mold exposure. I'm intrigued, man. I don't know if it interests you, or I would go with you.
Yeah, I would go with you too. And I do think that would be welcome, because I'm still dealing with, all of my allergic and hypersensitivities that I developed as a child. Most of them have gone away. But the other day I was outside and I'm allergic to some grasses. Like there are some things that were relics from my history that still present joint pain, things like that.
Yeah.
And my sensitivity to the musty smell, which I think, by the way, is an evolutionary advantage. I honestly think mold sensitivity is in fact, I think sensitivities in general are a sixth sense. I think it's a superpower that people relegate to they think it's a weakness because society marginalizes people with sensitivities. But the truth is that it's bad for everybody. The stuff that we're sensitive to is bad for everybody. It's just that we get the signal first. We're the canaries, and that means we can leave the mine, and the others can die at their own discretion. But for me, I look at this as a strength, not as a weakness. Although I would prefer not to have certain pain associated.
This is a belief system we share. What joint? When you say you get joint pain, what joints?
Mostly my left kinetic chain, a wrist all the way up, all the way down my shoulder, back all the way down, joint, my whole left kinetic chain all the way down to the bottom of my feet. But it's almost all my left side, and wrist, elbow, shoulder, ribs. But mostly it's wrist and elbow.
Okay. I'm not going to say I'm excited for you, but I am excited to do this experiment at some point.
I would love that. I welcome the opportunity to do that. And I think it'll be a lot of fun to do it together.
Amazing. So we established life. We walked through lifestyle, the idea that lifestyle can generate excessive moisture within the home. And then we obviously have these outside factors that could be more or less the landlord's responsibility. Regardless of what the moisture is, what can we do to protect ourselves?
Well, so going back to lifestyle for half a second, because that's where a lot of the responsibility on how you protect yourself lies. A big part of my message here is, is that what I want to do is empower people with the tools and knowledge they need to make better decisions about the air they breathe, which means to let them know, what actions are yours to take and what actions are someone else's to take, and how to know. It's like the serenity prayer, right? I feel like the serenity prayer helps people get sober. It also helps people stay healthy indoors. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And that is renting an apartment. Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So how do you know the difference, right? And so in a case like when you're dealing with when you've got a humidity issue, and you've got a humidity issue, it's showing up as condensation on your windows. There's dampness in the building. You've got your humidity sensor, and it says you're at 65%. And it shouldn't be that high. Well, are you using your bathroom exhaust vents? Are you using your kitchen exhaust vents? Are you running your AC on a consistent basis to dehumidify that space? And if you're not doing those things, then shame on you, right? That's really where your responsibility lies. The other thing is that when you see moisture coming from outside, whether it be a leak or a flood or any sort of incursion, your other responsibility is to notify the landlord. And this is really important. Okay. This is kind of where the rubber meets the road, and this is where most tenants fail. And this is why most of their cases also fail too. You have to let your landlord know in writing. I tell people to get a journal, and it's just for communications with your landlord. Handwritten is best. Don't be afraid to use different pencils and pens. If you ever go to court, the judge, they like to see that. It shows that you've taken the time to in real time to write down
that's a
what's going on.
Great
right?
point.
Very, very important. And a dedicated piece. Don't do it on a scrap of paper and write it on a note in your phone, and then another note in an Evernote, and another one on your notepad, and then all over the place. Get a little notepad and just write on the front, indoor air quality log or building or apartment log, whatever. And write down every single time that you've noticed any of the moisture issues, any of your symptoms, any of the odors, where you notice them. Get detailed about this stuff. This is like your personal injury log, But you want to really document all of your interactions with your landlord. Hey, I let them know. I told them in passing, verbally. And then you want to write a letter to them and explain to them what you found. When you ultimately want to do is make sure that you've got good documentation. If you've got a medical condition, you got to get a letter from your doctor. And then you need to let them know if you see a mold or moisture problem in writing. Here's what I saw. Here are the dates. And then you can say, this needs to be corrected. And this is important too. According to the IICRC S500 water damage standard and or the IICRC S520 mold remediation standard. And what happens is you let them know that this is a problem that needs to be corrected, and you give them usually a week for it to be corrected. If they continue to drag their feet, then you can in some cities, and again, this is why I'm not practicing law, and this is why you should research the statutes in your local area for these things. But the implied warranty of habitability will often allow you to begin paying your rent into escrow. And sending a copy of the bank statement to your landlord. And you basically have to let them know exactly what's going on, and that it needs to be corrected according to standards, and that you need to be involved in the selection criteria of the remediation contractor. Oh, by the way, that you have to have proper testing done. It has to be done. But again, you have to be able to vet these contractors and inspectors. And then you can pay rent into escrow, and the release is contingent upon the successful remediation of the property, including third-party verification of the air and surfaces that were remediated and cleaned, and the underlying repairs have been completed, and the water problem has been stopped. And if they don't complete it within a certain period of time, some people give a 30-day, 60-day period, you can then do something called constructive eviction, which is where you can terminate your lease without any negative consequences on your credit, and they have to release your security deposit, and you get to keep the rent that you paid into escrow. How do you like that?
That's a flex.
Big time.
That's what the kids say. That is a flex.
What are the
two policies? You said the IIRC S500.
IICRC is the industry is the committee or the trade association that is essentially our standards committee, standards body. So IICRC is the International Institute of Cleaning and Restoration Contractors, and they have a number of standards that are sort of they're the only consensus accepted standards in our industry, and so it's the S500, S is in Sam, as in standard, actually,
Sure.
500, and that's water damage. And so that clearly articulates how water damage is supposed to be handled, and at what point water damage needs to be handled like a mold job, right? And like I said before, that's the 3-day mark, right? You can deal with water damage until 3 days, and then it becomes mold, and then you have to bring in the guys in the moon suits, and those rules, the guys in the moon suits have to follow, or at least they're supposed to follow. There's no regulation that mandates this, by the way. This is an elective thing, which is why it's problematic.
Not
yet. A lot of companies. Not yet.
Maybe this is something. Maybe this. Have you ever been to Washington to lobby for anything?
I have not. I've been invited to do so, and in fact, recently by a nonprofit that's dealing with the Army mold issues, and we may be very well going down for that. But yes, no, I believe there's a lot of room for legislation on this to mandate best practices, and the other one is to make it illegal to put building materials in occupied buildings that are comprised of carcinogenic chemicals. That's a big one for me.
That's huge.
Huge. It's such a common sense thing. Like, who could disagree with that, right? But the people who make those decisions are the chemical companies that make our building materials, not us, right?
Yeah.
And it's an innocent until proven guilty formula in those. Same thing with big pharma. Same thing with big food. Same thing with big education. Even it's guilty. It's an innocent until proven guilty, and there's no onus for them to prove that what they're doing is in our best interest until they're proven that it's wrong, like asbestos or PFAS or some of these things that are happening right now.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is that the standards are very effective if followed, and the companies that do follow them tend to do much better work. So the S520 is the one that I hammer home, and it also advocates. It also says don't use chemicals during remediation, which is a huge thing that most people don't realize. It also advocates the independence between the contractors and the inspectors. You should never have the same people doing that work. It's a conflict of interest and there's room for lots and lots of abuse. So you want to make sure you have independent inspectors that have no financial relationships with your contractor.
Yeah.
And you want to select your own inspector if you can afford it, even if you're a renter, because it's whoever is paying that inspector is who he's biased towards. It's just human nature. There's no other way about it. And so if the landlord's paying for him, he's going to work for the landlord, and that's not your friend.
Jason, what's the S520 again?
The IICRC S520 mold remediation standard.
Oh, but we said an S500 and an S520 different, correct?
Yeah, S500 is water damage.
Okay.
And then S520 is when you haven't gotten to the water damage fast enough.
Yep.
Then you got to pick up the 520.
That's the mold remediation.
Yeah, and that talks about all the environmental controls with related as it relates to containment, negative air pressure, all the cleaning procedures,
yes,
all that kind of stuff. What materials can be cleaned, what materials have to be disposed of.
Did that,
that kind of stuff.
I got great pictures of that. I'll never forget it. It was so heartbreaking walking in and your floors are ripped up and the walls are stripped and there's these big scrubbers and everybody's in there and we did the disposable suits and the things and it was wild, man.
It's trippy. Yeah. It's very. It also makes you realize how these buildings are built. It's kind of you suddenly realize that we build buildings out of paper mache. These flimsy buildings that are basically. Yeah, my mentor says that we build self-composting buildings. Just add water.
Yeah, it's happening in Austin. It's unbelievable how fast the buildings go up, and I watch these buildings go up with plywood. You see and then they sit for a month. And then they put a moisture barrier up, and then they sit for another 2 months, and then
while it's getting rained on.
I mean, dude, I'm just like, what are they? What? This doesn't make sense to me. But you just watch it happening again and again and again, and it's unfortunately the way information moves and the way action is driven. It's usually not until somebody is deeply affected on a level, and if it's not you, it's hard because unless you felt it in your body, unless you experience these symptoms from going through a really bad mold exposure, you'd never know. I just had Chris Irwin, who you guys should talk. He's a retired Navy SEAL commander, and he had rented after going through really bad PTSD, he had rented a power washer, and he had a moldy garage, and he had went in the garage and power washed it and just nebulized everything. And then the next day he was in the, you know, you know, start the movie like in the emergency room, and thinking they had a brain tumor, and can't see anything on a scan, but the inflammation, he was just like, on the floor in a ball, just crying.
Yeah.
So
did he end up with hypersensitivity pneumonitis? Because that's usually, I mean, you get a big lungful and that'll change your world,
Yeah, I don't know if he's he's good. He's like 80% back. It was an amazing conversation, and again, there's other, we talked about the idea that the human we're like a Jenga piece, and so there were other things happening in his life and his terrain that came before that incident, but there was a clear line in the sand. This happened, then life felt like this. Yeah. So.
And it's not always like that, A lot of times it's more, it's a slower, you fade into it, and then you're like, how did that happen? But it's a really, when you have that bifurcation, you're like, boom, I know when this happened.
Yeah.
In a way, that's a gift, because it makes it easier for you to, pin the tail on the donkey and then go about fixing the consequences of it.
Well, Jason, that's it's a good walkthrough of how to protect yourself. I mean, I think that's quite clear.
I might actually interject a couple of things there, though.
You're allowed.
Because yes, yeah. So, thank you. So the first thing you want to do is you want to document. Okay. And by the way, I have an article I wrote about this on our website,
we'll tag
our Learning Center, which I'll make sure to send you a link to it, and it expands upon this in some detail. So I won't have to waste a lot of breath or take any more time, because we're a little over our intended window here.
We intended for 30 minutes. We're at 52, but
Freddie. I mean, the reality is, I don't think we've ever been able to have a brief conversation, because there's just so much to talk about. It's like every single time we get, whether it's in person or otherwise, it's, it's like, okay, we gotta go. But it's always such a pleasure, and I get as much out of this as I hope our listeners do.
This is the gold. Yeah, this is the gold. I love it. Absolutely. Please interject.
So the other thing you want to do to protect yourself is you want to you have an obligation to mitigate damages. You have an obligation to protect yourself, and when I say damages, I'm to the building is one thing, but also to your physical health. And so you want to make sure that you're doing, again, protect yourself using the ventilation and cleaning up moisture problems as they, if you see a leak, if the tub is overflow, clean it up quickly. You don't leave damp towels, all over the place. Just common sense stuff. I mean, but this is not, by the way, also, no wet heads on the bed. This is just a side note. Dust mites grow like crazy. Wet heads in bed. No wet heads in bed. No wet towels on beds. This is what grows those things. So if you've got sensitivities around allergies and allergens, don't do stuff like that. Dampness is in general something that you really want to control and minimize. But when it comes to protecting yourself on an ongoing basis, especially as a renter, getting yourself some really good air purifiers is key, because A, they work really well in small spaces, and B, you can take them with you when you leave. You do not depend on filters that are in HVAC systems, because they are actually not for your air; they're for the equipment, to keep the equipment clean. They are what you want are really good HEPA filters, ideally that have a lot of carbon in them. And so HEPA filters are a dime a dozen these days. Ones that have a lot of carbon in them tend to be more expensive, and they're a little more problematic because they cost more money to maintain. You have to swap out those carbon filters more often than you do the HEPA filters, because they get saturated. But the HEPA filter will take out particles like spores, pollen, building material, gut dust, like I talked about earlier. And then the carbon filters will take out VOCs. And buildings that are rental buildings are almost always loaded with VOCs. Why? Because they use the cheapest materials they possibly can to build, and then also to, when they go to repaint. That's another pro tip. If you're going to have a landlord, this just came. If you're going to have a landlord repaint your space before you move in, which is something that's required in many cities, mandate as part of your negotiation that they use no VOC paint. Otherwise, they're painting your indoor environment with petrochemicals, and you're going to move in and breathe that, and it's going to off gas for longer than the term of your lease. And you'll be breathing that stuff, and you'll be saying, "I've got headaches, I've got fatigue, I can't get out of bed, I feel like crap. Why is everyone so low energy here? I've got emotional dysregulation." And by the way, that also is a prelude to, if you're already teetering immunologically, it's a good entryway to cancer too, right? You don't need to be breathing that shit. It's bad news. So you really want to make sure that you want to make sure that you can intervene early in that, but then also get yourself some good air purifiers. IQ Air makes a really big one. It's expensive. Jasper makes a really good one. They're also on the high end. Air Doctor makes good units with lots of air, with lots of carbon in them.
I have an Air Doctor. Is Air Doctor going to be sufficient for the VOCs as well? I know you had our good friend. Yeah. I know you had said our good friend Lev had got that massive one, the square one that I had rolled into the apartment, and I tried it over here for a while.
Yeah, I'd have to see the actual unit, but basically when you look at air purifiers and you look at carbon, you want to look at how many pounds of carbon they have.
Okay.
This is not the inches, not measurements like a quarter of an inch, an eighth of an inch. The IQ Air unit has 8 pounds.
Wow.
Right. So that's right. That's a lot of surface area inside to adsorb to capture those VOCs. It's a big deal. So you also want to get yourself a HEPA filtered vacuum cleaner. Because any other vacuum cleaner just distributes particles, microscopic particles, breaks up allergens into really deeply respirable particles and spreads them all over your house. In fact, you'll often notice if you use a non-HEPA filtered vacuum cleaner that you have to dust the next day. Well, why is that? Well, because you created a microscopic dust cloud. And so a HEPA filtered vacuum cleaner is your friend when it comes to these things. So protecting yourself is a combination of awareness and action, right? First, you have to have the awareness, and then you have to take the action. And sometimes that action means that you have to have the right tools. But the best tools for this are humidity gauge, HEPA filtered air cleaner with carbon, and HEPA filtered vacuum cleaner. Those three things are like the triumvirate of healthy indoor air. And then if you want to take it up a notch, you could do things like putting allergen encasements on your bed and those kinds of things, which are just sort of like, general preventive measures, especially for people that are atopic or allergic. But really it's that humidity gauge, HEPA filtered vacuum cleaner, HEPA filtered air cleaner with carbon. If you have those three and you use them, and then you use the tools in the building, you will give yourself at least a head start. And then if you ever have an issue whatsoever, document, and communicate in writing. And if you do that, you are head and shoulders above the rest of the pack.
Yeah. Well, we left off a big one. What about testing? Yes.
Well, so testing. I mean, we left a big one. Yeah, which
it's the biggest one. It's like what Got Mold stands for. I have 2 kits in my home. I'm like ready to do it. I've had 2 days of no rain, so I'm ready to do my Got Mold test.
Yeah. So, what's interesting about testing is it's very important to focus when you're dealing with landlord tenant issues, to focus on mold but most importantly, moisture, because moisture intrusion, moisture problems is actually what will get you, which will win your case when it comes to this stuff. Believe it or not, mold doesn't win the case. But mold, when you document the presence of mold through a test kit or otherwise, photos, or testing, and we can talk about the test kit for a hot minute. But what you're really doing there is demonstrating that you have a moisture problem, because when you get into the mold conversation, a lot of lawyers will balk because they'll say, "Well, that's a personal injury, and that you're gonna have to have lots of experts. It's gonna be very expensive." And what you want to do is steer away from the idea that mold is making me sick. You want to stay focused on the fact that the building has an unhealthy condition, and it's not safe or clean. See, this is very important. You start getting over into the mold conversation, it's very convoluted, and then that's where things flap in the wind and you lose. It's safe and clean. Implied warranty of habitability, safe and clean. Well, what makes something safer? Well, absence of moisture conditions. You cannot have a moisture problem in a building. How do I know I have a moisture problem in the building? There's mold growth. There's mold growth. That's the
Yeah.
proof. Not that the mold is making you sick. That's not the argument. The argument that the building is not safe or clean. See what I mean? Reel
Yes.
it back in. Reel it back in. As soon as you get back out and making this a personal thing, it's not the point. It's objective, safe and clean. Mold is the symptom. So how do you document the presence of mold? Okay, there's a few different things. First of all, there are surface tests that you can do, and people often go to swabs. Don't do swabs. If you need to document the presence of actual mold growth on a surface, what you want to get are tape lifts. We don't sell them, but they do. They're effective at proving the presence of mold growth on a surface. Okay, and that's what you need, because it'll actually pick up the fungal structures, the mycelium, the actual, so you can say that's mold growth, as opposed to swab, which just picks up spores and then they culture that, and that just shows that there's spores everywhere. Well, we know that, right? 500,000 blue whales every year, 13.7 miles above the Earth's surface. We know spores are everywhere.
This
Swabbing
is the ecosystem we live in. Yes.
It just proves that mold spores are ubiquitous. Great. You've just done a sixth grade science experiment. Okay. What you need to do is document the presence of growth on a surface. And you do that with a photo and a surface test, and a tape lift rather. Okay. Now, if you want to test the air for mold, that's our specialty. And so at gotmold.com, we offer a very, very high quality, low cost, do it yourself air testing kit. And it uses a device called spore traps. Or it uses devices called spore traps, which capture the airborne microscopic particles using an air sampling pump. And that pump pulls air through these cassettes. They're kind of like a filter, and it captures the pollen and the spores and the any of the airborne microscopic dust. And then it goes into a prepaid return mailer. And that goes to our lab partner, the number one lab in the country. And they analyze it. Within 3 business days, you get a really nice color-coded, easy to interpret report, and you can speak to the ease of use on that. And so you get a green, yellow, orange, or red indicator. Plus, so you can see at a glance whether or not you've got something that's alarming. And then you also get the actual lab data, which is really useful because a professional can look at that and go, "Oh, I agree with that." And now that interpretation. And then thirdly, it includes a number of follow-up recommendations, things to do next, resources, how to find an inspector, how to find a remediator, some self-assessment tools, and an ebook that we produced, which helps people a lot with frequently asked questions and inspection checklists. And a lot of the stuff we talked about today is actually in that ebook called How to Find Mold, which you can also, by the way, find in a footer at gotmold.com.
We'll link that in the show notes. Jason, what is your testing for?
Yeah, so it tests for ambient mold spores. So again, spores are a normal part of our environment. What we want to see with our test is we want to see the types of spores that are present in your air and the quantities. So it begins with an outdoor air sample. All reputable air sampling has to involve an outdoor reference sample, because spore types are different in every climate, and also even within that climate, they change from day to day, minute to minute, season to season for sure, but literally minute to minute, based upon outdoor conditions, whether it's raining or hot or humid or cold. So it just ebbs and flows. It's like a kaleidoscope, and so a spore kaleidoscope, and so that air will invariably infiltrate into a building. And so when we test the air in a building, we want it to look a lot like what we see outside. Otherwise, if there's different types and different quantities, in other words, like high concentrations of different organisms in the building, that's a clear indication that something's growing in the building. And it's very important to also say that mold spores are not just a regular part of our environment. They're an extremely important part of a healthy environment. So the data is very strong on this. You want lots of different microbes in your house. In fact, the higher number of microbes you have in your house, the higher diversity you have within a building, directly correlates to lower cases of asthma, allergies, autoimmune disease, and now they're saying even autism and things like that, right? And when you've got a low microbial diversity, which is usually caused by too much HEPA filters and HEPA vacuums without ever opening the windows, right? So sterilizing the environment mechanically or sterilizing the environment chemically. So too many antimicrobials, too many bleach wipes, too many hand sanitizers. That stuff has a direct correlation, and the numbers are outrageously distinct. Very high spike in asthma, allergies, autoimmune disease, and of course, they're saying now autism and other neurological and developmental issues too. And so we know this to be true in our gut. Diversity is everything. We know this to be true in our microbiome. It's also true the microbiome in our building, as above, so below. These are nesting ecologies. This is the way I like to think about it. And so we're like Matryoshka dolls, the Russian ones that stack up. The building ecology is, and the outdoor environment should look a lot like the indoor environment without having, with some exceptions. And then the same thing on our body. We want to have that high microbial diversity. We are microbial. 37 trillion microbes. We are 37 trillion cells, and then 35 trillion microbial cells in and around us. And so we don't need to kill these things. What we need to do is create a healthy environment for them to prosper. And as soon as you have a high concentration of any organism, that's a clear indication that there's an imbalance in the environment, whether it be in you, on you, or around you. That makes sense?
Well, it's echoing, we just had Kiran Krishnan from Microbiome Labs, and we just talked about alpha diversity, and he went through every single health condition and how an amplified alpha diversity within the gut is less long-term chronic disease. And this is the research they do again and again and again. So it's just looking at this hyper-sterility. It's a message that comes across through different speakers such as yourself or Kiran, and it's echoed throughout the community. The people who are experiencing robust health, they're living this. They're looking at the whole picture. So I just think, summing it all up, to look at this, it is our relationship with moisture, our relationship with mold, our relationship with the outside world, that we can always interpersonal communication. It is how we are in relationship with defines our emotional health.
Indeed.
And that's, for me, if we were to look at all the things we have control over, it's creating this shared reality with whether it's the mold or the moisture or my neighbor.
Indeed. And I would even say the relationship with your building. I look at the buildings that we live and work in as an extension of our immune system, like an exoskin or an exoskeleton. We wouldn't do too well without them, kind of like a hermit crab. We kind of need that shell.
Yes.
And the health of that shell and how well it's maintained it directly impacts our health. I mean, a sick building creates sick individuals. And when that building heals, so too do the people that live within it. And so I encourage people to really look at the buildings not as these static boxes, these inanimate things, but really as an extension of your immune system, and your relationship. I don't suggest that we have to be house whisperers, but you should be in tune with it so that you should be looking around the same way you look at your body. If you see a red spot or a mole that's turning into this really weird thing, you're going to take action on that. The same thing should be done with your building, whether you own it or rent it. Doesn't matter, because it is, whether you own it or rent it, still your shell. And it still is the protective mechanism around you that should be a source of safety and rest and rejuvenation, not a source of illness or discomfort.
Yeah. It's amazing advice, Jason. I honor your time here. I honor your information that you bring to the table and what you're doing in the world. It's really clear. And we will put all the links that you mentioned so people can do a deep dive on the article if they want things written out in black and white. But what I'm hearing from this podcast is you owe it to yourself to understand the relationship with your home, and whether it's making you healthy or supporting robust health, or it's making you ill. And this seems very clear to me. So I'm really excited for people to take action on this one. We'll really push this podcast hard. I think it's so important, and it's relatively simple.
It is.
It's not overly complicated.
If you get rid of the misinformation and the myths, and you're willing to sort of what we think you already know prevents you from learning, right? And so people come to the subject matter with all sorts of preconceived notions that they heard from their uncle, their mom, their grandmother, what they found online, or they heard from the local remediation contractor who came in for a free inspection to give them to bid on the project. That you take all that stuff and then you go greet this new information that we're providing here, for example, and you go, but that's not what I heard before. take all that stuff, put it in a box, and burn it, because what you're dealing with there is a lot of conflicts of interest, a lot of misinformation. I'm at 30,000 feet on this stuff because I get to see all these buildings and see all these lab reports. I know what works, and I don't sell solutions, so I get to be in this really cool place where I can just go, hey, this is what I know that works.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with what I'm selling, because all I sell is a tool that lets you quantify the stuff.
Yeah.
So I get to be agnostic on these things, which gives me this really objective view, and allows me to not get caught up in all the rigmarole, all this, he said, she said stuff. No, this is a clearly defined thing, and it's a lot simpler than people think. To your point,
Amazing. We are going to close it down. We did pretty good. An hour and 10 minutes. I'm impressed.
Not so bad.
No, it's great.
We could have gone 2 hours on this thing,
please.
without a problem.
I've held back so many. There's so many times I've held back.
Me too.
It's a topic I love to talk about. It is so we just need mental clarity. We need cognition. We need access to the right words at this time in humanity. How important to be able to express yourself without wandering all over the place. So we're going to cut it down there. We'll do more. Within the thing, I was like, oh, we can do one for, there's definitely a why I can't get better episode, because I also hear, the things we just walked through are often steps people are not looking at. They're jumping to, I'm going to go do all these fancy IVs with this person. I'm like, well, have you looked at the, order of operations? There's a why I can't get better episode. There's definitively a travel episode. Mold avoidance or mold management travelers, which I just think is shit. How important. And then there's a couple other. I design your dream home that's living in resonance with the environment. If you just have money's not a thing, you got a magic wand. What are you building? How are you building it? What materials are you using? That would be a fun thought experiment.
Yeah, and funny enough, just a quick side note, I'll plant a seed here. We can revisit that. I'm working with a developer. We're looking at property right now in a few different states, particularly in Arizona and the Tucson area, to build a healthy apartment building that we will potentially condos, where we'll lease with a purchase option for people who are getting back on their feet after toxic exposures. But it would be completely made of inert materials, EMF shielded, hardwired internet. Without Wi-Fi, rainwater capture, all that kind of stuff.
Fun.
So building something that would be truly the high-end property for people who want that, who will invest in that with a certain amount of subsidized sort of like lease with purchase option to help people who are seeking this but have lost everything, which is, unfortunately.
It's a lot of people.
All too common.
I could have sent you 10 people last year for that.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
So there's a lot here.
Yeah, there is a lot there. Oh, there was a question in there in that building, that ideal dream structure that is amplifying health. I'll think of it next time. Jason, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Likewise,
and till next time, everybody, you can get Jason's test, Got Mold, on the Beautifully Broken store. It's beautifullybroken.world. It's in our store. It's listed there with a discount code. I believe it's Beautifully Broken, but I'll drop that at the front of the episode. And until next time, love you guys. Namaste.